Imagine coming home each day, exhausted from work, and being greeted not by a family dog or a playful cat, but by a bobcat, waiting eagerly to wrap its powerful paws around you in a genuine, heartfelt hug. Meet Mark Henderson, whose life took an extraordinary turn when he rescued a tiny, helpless bobcat kitten named Orion from the unforgiving Montana wilderness. Their journey together started as a frantic rescue mission, but evolved into an unforgettable bond of trust and affection. This is the remarkable story of a man and a bobcat who learned from each other that trust and affection can bridge even the widest divides. And you won't believe how this bobcat learned to ask for a hug. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Mark Henderson never imagined his life would revolve around teaching a wild predator the art of the perfect hug. Yet here he was, standing in his mudroom at 5:58 p.m., adjusting the thick leather sleeve he'd fashioned from an old welder's jacket, waiting for the familiar sound of padded paws on hardwood. It had all started 18 months ago on a bitter February morning in the mountains of northern Montana. Mark, a wildlife photographer who'd retreated to his late grandmother's cottage after a messy divorce, was trudging through fresh snow when he heard the weakest sound, a mewling cry that could have been mistaken for wind through the pines. Following the sound, he discovered a bobcat kitten, no more than 3 weeks old, huddled against its mother's still form. The adult had been caught in an illegal trap, and despite Mark's years of photographing wildlife, he'd never seen anything quite so heartbreaking. The kitten, he'd name it Orion later after the constellation that dominated the winter sky that night, weighed less than a pound. Its eyes were barely open, its spotted coat matted with snow. Mark knew the rules. Don't interfere with nature, call fish and wildlife, let the professionals handle it. But the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was 4 hours away. A snowstorm was rolling in, and the kitten's labored breathing suggested it wouldn't last the journey. Just for tonight, Mark had told himself, tucking the tiny creature inside his parka. Just until the storm passes. Famous last words. The first week was a blur of sleepless nights, emergency vet visits, and frantic Google searches about bobcat care. Dr. Patricia Lowry, the local veterinarian who'd been treating ranch animals for 30 years, had looked at Mark like he'd lost his mind when he walked in with a bobcat kitten wrapped in his grandmother's quilt. "You realize this is a wild animal, not a house cat?" she'd said, even as she prepared a syringe of antibiotics. "I know," Mark had replied, watching the kitten struggle to breathe. "But what else was I supposed to do?" Dr. Lowry had sighed, the deep sigh of someone who'd seen enough soft-hearted fools to know arguing was pointless. "Well, if you're going to do this, you're going to do it right. Here's what you need to know." What followed was a crash course in bobcat nutrition, behavior, and the legal requirements for keeping a wild animal. Montana law allowed for temporary rehabilitation of orphaned wildlife, but Mark would need permits, regular inspections, and a plan for eventual release. The kitten would need a specialized diet, a proper enclosure, and minimal human contact to preserve its wild instincts. Mark followed every rule to the letter. Well, almost every rule. The minimal human contact part proved challenging when Orion, as he'd named the kitten after its rescue night, refused to sleep anywhere but curled against Mark's chest. Those early weeks were a comedy of errors. Orion attempting to nurse on Mark's thumb, leaving tiny puncture wounds. Orion discovering that human toes under blankets made excellent hunting practice at 3 a.m. Orion learning to open cabinet doors and systematically shredding every roll of toilet paper in the house. "You look terrible," Nancy Chen from the general store had told Mark one morning when he stumbled in for more kitten formula, sporting fresh scratches and the glazed look of the chronically sleep-deprived. "Thanks," Mark had muttered. The baby's teething. Nancy had laughed until she realized he wasn't joking. As spring arrived and Orion grew from a palm-sized furball to a leggy adolescent, Mark began building an outdoor enclosure. It was a massive construction project that ate up most of his savings. 2,000 square feet of chain link, wooden platforms, a heated shelter, and even a small pond. His nearest neighbor, Bill Morrison, had driven over on his tractor to investigate the commotion. "Building a zoo?" Bill had asked, watching Mark wrestle with a roll of fencing. "Something like that," Mark had grunted. But even with the enclosure, Orion had privileges no wild bobcat should have. Every evening, as Mark returned from his photography expeditions, Orion would be waiting by the gate. At first, the reunions were chaotic affairs. Orion, displaying the exuberance of a creature that didn't quite grasp the concept of personal space, would launch himself at Mark with the force of a spotted missile. The first time it happened, Mark had ended up flat on his back in the dirt, 30 pounds of adolescent bobcat standing on his chest, purring like a diesel engine while methodically grooming Mark's beard with a sandpaper tongue. "Okay, buddy," Mark had wheezed. "We need to work on your greeting etiquette." But it was the hugging that became their signature move, though it started as more of a full contact sport than a display of affection. Orion had developed this peculiar behavior around his 6th month, standing on his hind legs when Mark approached, front paws spread wide, head tilted back in what could only be described as an expectant pose. The first time Mark had tried to respond to this gesture, he'd ended up needing a tetanus shot and a new shirt. Orion's idea of a hug involved wrapping his front legs around Mark's torso and hanging on with every claw extended, like a very affectionate bear trap. "He's trying to show affection," Dr. Lowry had said while cleaning Mark's wounds. "In the wild, bobcat mothers carry their young by gripping them. He's probably trying to recreate that bonding behavior." "Great," Mark had said through gritted teeth as she applied antiseptic. "Any chance we could recreate it without the bloodshed?" That's when Mark had his brilliant idea, or what seemed brilliant at the time. He'd found an old welder's jacket at a yard sale, thick leather with padded arms. He'd reinforced it with additional padding and started what he called hug training. The process was hilarious in hindsight, though Mark's neighbors probably thought he'd completely lost it. Picture a grown man in what looked like medieval armor, teaching a bobcat the proper way to embrace. Mark would approach slowly, arms protected by the leather sleeves, and let Orion grip the padding instead of flesh. Gradually, oh so gradually, Orion learned to control his claws, to grip gently rather than pierce. It took months. Months of Mark looking like he'd been through a blender, months of his photography clients asking if he'd taken up a dangerous new hobby, months of Bill Morrison shaking his head and muttering about city folks, even though Mark had grown up just 2 counties over. But then, one evening in late autumn, it happened. Mark came home from a particularly long day photographing elk in Glacier National Park. He was tired, cold, and had missed the shot he'd been planning for weeks. As always, Orion was waiting by the enclosure gate, rising onto his hind legs in his familiar pose. Mark, still wearing his regular jacket instead of the protective gear, almost turned back to get it. But something in Orion's eyes, a soft, amber glow in the fading light, made him pause. Slowly, carefully, he opened his arms. Orion moved forward with a grace that belied his size. His paws wrapped around Mark's shoulders, claws retracted, his weight balanced perfectly so as not to knock Mark over. For a moment, they stood there, man and bobcat, in an embrace that would have been impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't lived through the months of trial and error. Mark felt Orion's purr vibrating through his chest, felt the warm breath against his neck, felt the gentle kneading of paws that had learned, finally, to show love without leaving marks. His eyes burned with unexpected tears. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good boy, Orion." From that day forward, the evening hug became their ritual. Every day at 6 o'clock, no matter the weather, no matter how tired Mark was, they would share this moment. Word spread, as word does in small communities. People began timing their evening walks to catch a glimpse of the man hugging a bobcat. Nancy from the general store brought her grandchildren to see. Bill Morrison brought his poker buddies, though he prefaced the viewing with, "Now don't go trying this at home. Mark's a special kind of crazy." The local newspaper ran a story. Mountain Man's Wild Embrace. Local photographer's unusual bond with rescued bobcat. The article went viral, leading to an influx of curious visitors that Mark had to politely but firmly turn away. Orion was not a tourist attraction, but fame brought complications. The Fish and Wildlife Department, prompted by the publicity, conducted a surprise inspection. Officer Janet Rodriguez arrived on a crisp November morning, clipboard in hand, expression professionally neutral. "Mr. Henderson," she said, after examining the enclosure, the permits, the veterinary records, "you understand that Orion is approaching the age where release becomes necessary?" Mark's stomach dropped. He'd known this day would come, had been dreading it for months. "He's bonded to humans," Mark argued. "He wouldn't survive in the wild." "That's exactly the problem," Officer Rodriguez said, though her tone was not unkind. "Wild animals that become too habituated to humans pose a danger, to themselves, and to people who might not understand the difference between a rescued bobcat and a wild one." She gave him until spring, 6 months to prepare Orion for release or find him a placement in a licensed wildlife sanctuary. Mark threw himself into research. He contacted every sanctuary within 1,000 miles, but they were all full or couldn't take an animal as humanized as Orion. He began teaching Orion hunting skills, using remote-controlled toys to simulate prey, but Orion treated it like a game, always bringing the kill back to Mark for approval. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the mountains in feet of snow. Mark watched Orion play in his enclosure, marveling at how his spotted coat disappeared against the dappled shadows. The bobcat was magnificent, there was no denying it. Nearly 40 pounds of muscle and grace, with tufted ears that swiveled at the slightest sound, and eyes that could spot a mouse at 50 yards. He belonged in the wild, but he also belonged here, sharing evening hugs with the human who'd raised him. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Lowry called one February morning with news that would change everything. "There's a wildlife education center opening in Bozeman," she said. "They're looking for animal ambassadors, rescued animals that can't be released but can help teach people about wildlife conservation. I may have mentioned your situation." Mark drove to Bozeman the next day, Orion secure in a specially built transport crate in the back of his truck. The Yellowstone Wildlife Education Center was impressive. Spacious enclosures, professional staff, and a mission that resonated with Mark's own values about wildlife photography, helping people understand and appreciate wild animals while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The director, Dr. Michael Reeves, was a soft-spoken man with decades of experience in wildlife rehabilitation. He listened to Mark's story, reviewed Orion's history, and then asked to meet the bobcat himself. Mark had brought the leather jacket. What happened next would become legend at the center. Mark opened the crate, and Orion emerged cautiously, ears flat, eyes scanning the unfamiliar environment. Then he spotted Mark and, despite the strange surroundings, rose onto his hind legs in his familiar pose. Mark looked at Dr. Reeves, who nodded. Stepping forward, Mark opened his arms, and Orion flowed into them with the practiced ease of hundreds of evening hugs. Dr. Reeves's professional composure cracked, and he actually laughed out loud. "In 30 years," he said, "I've never seen anything quite like that." They worked out an arrangement that was unusual but perfect. Orion would live at the center, serving as an ambassador for his species, teaching thousands of visitors about bobcats and the importance of wildlife conservation. But Mark would be his primary handler, driving down 3 times a week to maintain their bond and assist with educational programs. "We'll build the evening hug into his routine," Dr. Reeves said with a smile. "It'll be the highlight of our evening tours." The transition wasn't easy. The first night at the center, Orion paced his new enclosure, calling with the peculiar yowl that bobcats make when distressed. Mark, sleeping in his truck in the parking lot, he'd told the staff he was heading home but couldn't bring himself to leave, heard every cry. But Orion was adaptable, as wild animals must be. Within a week, he'd claimed his new territory, marking favorite perches and establishing routines. He charmed the staff with his quirky personality. He had a particular fondness for cardboard boxes, like a giant house cat, and would spend hours stalking and pouncing on enrichment toys. And 3 evenings a week, as the sun set behind the Bridger Mountains, Mark would arrive for what became the center's most popular demonstration. Visitors would gather, cameras ready, as Mark entered the enclosure. Orion, who might have been lounging on his platform or playing in his pool, would immediately abandon whatever he was doing and approach with that distinctive rolling gait of a bobcat on a mission. The ritual never changed. Orion would rise onto his hind legs, paws spread wide, head tilted back. Mark would open his arms, and they would embrace. A perfect meeting of wild and tame, of instinct and learned behavior, of 2 souls who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. "What you're seeing," Mark would tell the assembled visitors, his arms full of purring bobcat, "is not typical bobcat behavior. This is the result of a unique situation and months of careful training. Wild bobcats are solitary, elusive creatures that want nothing to do with humans, and that's how it should be." He'd go on to talk about habitat preservation, about the challenges facing wild predators, about the importance of keeping wild animals wild. But even as he delivered his practiced speech, Orion would be kneading his shoulders gently, purring with the contentment of an animal that knew exactly where it belonged. One evening, a little girl in the audience raised her hand. "Mr. Mark," she asked, "does Orion love you?" Mark paused, feeling Orion's warm weight against his chest. It was a question he'd grappled with himself. Could a wild animal truly love a human? Or was it all just conditioning, instinct, a result of neural pathways formed in kittenhood? "I think," he said slowly, "that love comes in many forms. Orion shows me trust, which for a wild animal is perhaps the deepest form of love there is. He trusts me enough to be vulnerable, to show affection in his own way. And I love him enough to make sure he has the best life possible, even when that means sharing him with all of you." The little girl nodded solemnly, satisfied with this answer. As the months passed, Orion became a celebrity of sorts. The center's social media posts featuring the hugging bobcat drew millions of views. Donations poured in, funding new education programs and habitat preservation efforts. School groups traveled from across the state to meet Orion and learn about Montana's wild predators. But for Mark, the fame was secondary to those quiet moments in the enclosure when the visitors had gone home and it was just him and Orion sharing their evening ritual. Sometimes he'd stay after hours, sitting in the enclosure while Orion dozed beside him, one large paw resting on Mark's leg as if to ensure he didn't leave without saying goodbye. Dr. Lowry visited one evening, watching from outside the enclosure as Mark and Orion performed their embrace. "You know," she said, "I thought you were crazy when you first brought him in." "And now?" Mark asked, gently extricating himself from Orion's grip. "Now I think you're crazy in the best possible way," she said. "You've given that animal something most rescued wildlife never get. A second chance at life without losing his essential wildness. He's still a bobcat, just one that happens to have figured out hugging." As their second winter together at the center approached, Mark reflected on the journey that had brought them here. What had started as a desperate rescue on a snowy morning had evolved into something neither fully wild nor fully tame, but perfect in its own unique way. The evening hugs continued, a daily reminder that connections between species, while rare and requiring careful navigation, could enrich both lives immeasurably. Orion had taught Mark about trust, patience, and the importance of meeting others, whether human or animal, where they were, not where you expected them to be. And Mark had given Orion safety, purpose, and a bridge between the wild world he'd been born to and the human world that had saved him. On particularly cold evenings, when the Montana wind howled through the valley and snow fell in thick curtains, Mark would arrive at the center to find Orion already waiting by the enclosure door, having somehow sensed his approach before his truck even pulled into the parking lot. The bobcat would pace excitedly, chirping and trilling in greeting, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. These were Mark's favorite moments. Before the formal demonstration, before the cameras and questions. Just a man and a bobcat, connected by an improbable bond that had survived scratches and setbacks, legal challenges and lifestyle changes. As he opened the enclosure door and Orion rose up for their embrace, Mark would feel the weight of those 40 pounds of muscle and fur not as a burden, but as a blessing. "Hey, buddy," he'd whisper into the tufted ears. "Miss me?" Orion's rumbling purr was answer enough. Their story continued to inspire. A documentary filmmaker spent 6 months chronicling their relationship, resulting in a film that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. Wildlife biologists studied their interaction, publishing papers on human-animal bonding and its implications for conservation education. But perhaps most importantly, thousands of children met Orion and left with a new appreciation for the wild predators that shared their state. One autumn evening, as Mark prepared for the daily hug, he noticed Orion moving a bit slower than usual. The bobcat was approaching middle age, 7 years old now, still healthy, but beginning to show the dignity of maturity. His coat had thickened, his muscles grown even more powerful, but there was a wisdom in those amber eyes that hadn't been there in youth. The hug that evening lasted longer than usual. Orion seemed content to simply lean into Mark, purring steadily, his eyes half closed in contentment. The assembled visitors were unusually quiet, sensing perhaps that they were witnessing something profound, not just a trained behavior, but a genuine moment of connection between two beings who had chosen, against all odds and natural instincts, to trust each other completely. As they finally parted, Orion did something new. He reached up with one large paw and gently patted Mark's cheek, claws fully retracted, the gesture unmistakably tender. The crowd gasped, and Mark felt his eyes sting with tears he didn't try to hide. "I love you too, buddy," he said softly. Dr. Reeves, watching from the sidelines, would later tell his staff that in 4 decades of working with wildlife, he'd never seen anything that moved him quite as much as that gentle pat. The story of Mark and Orion became a cornerstone of the center's educational mission, living proof that while wild animals should remain wild, the capacity for connection across species boundaries was part of what made the natural world so endlessly fascinating. It challenged visitors to think differently about wildlife, to see beyond the categories of wild and tame, to something more nuanced and beautiful. And every evening, 3 times a week, as the sun painted the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold, a bobcat would stand on his hind legs and open his front legs wide, waiting for the embrace that had become as natural as breathing. In those moments, the improbable became routine, the impossible became real, and love, in all its wild, unpredictable forms, found its perfect expression in a hug between a man and the bobcat who taught him that sometimes the best things in life come with claws, but learn to retract them.